Okay, in this tutorial, we're going to be introduced to the cloner and a couple modes that the cloner has. And then we are going to take the objects that we've cloned and we're going to use them as the basis for a scene to look at how the more advanced camera features function on the Redshift camera and how we access those and get those to work. Specifically depth of field, and some of the bokeh and some of the other things that make it feel like an actual camera has taken a photo of the scene. And so we're going to be making these things reasonably small to start with, because for those physical camera effects to work and look correct, these things need to be in scale. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to pretend we're making, a bunch of marbles. So we're going to take a sphere. We are going to set the size of that sphere, at least initially, to 2 centimeters, which is a big marble, but it's close enough. And I'm going to hit the letter S so I can zoom in on that one marble. Right, so I've got this one marble, and you can imagine that it can be really challenging if I wanted to, say, put all of these objects on like a landscape or some other object, like they're, say, spilled at random across a floor or, something like that. So we need to be able to adjust that to create multiple copies. And that's what the cloner does, right? We've used the array previously. It's pretty limited in what it can do. And the cloner just does a much better job at pretty much everything. So let's go ahead and create our cloner. The cloner is so useful that it is the top level object for this menu. So I'm going to click to create a cloner. I'm going to go ahead and drop my sphere in the cloner. And once I do that, we're not seeing anything different really except this little dot up here. So let's go ahead and hit the letter S on the keyboard. Oh, let's select the cloner, hit the letter S on the keyboard. Odd. Don't know why it's not choosing to. There we go. I had to click back in the viewport. So you can see it's made clones. They're really spread out and they're in a grid. So if we have our cloner selected and we look down, we'll see we're in grid mode. We're on iterate. We have this count 3 by 1 by 3, which is 3, 3, and 1. And then we're in per step mode with 200 centimeters, 200 centimeters, and 200 centimeters, right? So there's per step, there's endpoint mode as well. If I click on that, you'll see 0 is my endpoint for the Y direction because we're not going up or down at all. But endpoint mode means it says it's 400 centimeters here, right? That basically means from the center of this clone to the center of this clone is 400 centimeters, right? Or 200 per step. But since we have our clones at 2 centimeters, let's go ahead and see what happens if we just drop these two values in the per step mode down to 2. And then I'm going to hit the letter S again to zoom in. And I want you to see that, right, it's measuring that distance of 2 from the center of this clone to the center of this clone, right? So they're all kind of lumped together and on top of one another. So really we would want this to be 4 by 4, right, to create that like grid where they're all just barely touching, right? So if we want to increase our number of clones, all we do is we say, we come up here and we say, okay, well, let's maybe make 4 this way. Let's make 4 this way. Right, that's pretty great. Let's say and let's say we know we need 16, or maybe we want 2 rows of 16. So we're going to say 2 here. And note, right now my per step in the Y direction is 0 because I had switched to endpoint mode where it was 0 there. So I just have to hit 4 here, and then I will get, right, 2 rows of clones. So sometimes we know the total number of clones we want and the distance we want them to be apart from one another. Other times we know the total distance that we need, but we don't know how many clones it's going to take to fill that evenly. And so that's what endpoint mode is for. And so if I was to say, oh, well, in this dimension, maybe I want this to be, I have something that's 4 centimeters by 24 by 12. So I'm going to make this 24. And then what I can do is I can just increase the count in this direction until I have basically filled that space. And I know that in this case they're all divisible, so it's going to be an even number and an even spacing. But that way I can go, oh, it took 7. I couldn't do the math. Right? But so, and sometimes obviously the objects are going to be more complex than what we're working with, right? But so those are those 2 modes in this step. If I go back to per step, if I click on sphere, it's not going to show anything. Cylinder, right? What it's trying to do is it's trying to fit all of our clones into a cylinder or sphere or whatever. If I go to endpoint mode here and set all of these to 24, I might be able to get clones to show up. Sphere mode is kind of a little bit fussy. I'm not quite sure why it's such a pain, but it certainly is. It looks like it wanted more clones in in one of the directions in order to show up, right? So there's just different basic shapes that that it will try and fill up. Note that if they are different sizes, it's going to warp the dimensions. So if I just said this is 5 by 5 by 5, it'll be more even looking. If I go to per step mode, again, right, you can kind of stretch things out. It's just another way to work, right? And this is grid mode. This is like your standard mode that doesn't have a whole lot of interesting things going on with it. One thing to note with the cloner is you can have as many different objects be clones as you want. So if I create a cube and make it 2 by 2 by 2 centimeters, so it's about the same size, and drop it in this cloner, you'll see that it's replaced every other clone with a cube. And so I can go ahead and if I go to my cloner, you'll see that there are these different modes: iterate, random, sort, blend, etc. If I do blend, it's sort of a mix, and I don't know if this fill value, that just adjusts if they're there or not. And so yeah, so there are several other sort. Basically just takes the top clone. Iterate is every other. So if I switch modes now, let's say I want to do a radial cloner. So radial, right, just note it will save everything I've done. So I can feel free to switch modes here, and whatever I left it at in the other mode is what it's going to go back to. So radial mode, right, I can increase the count. I can adjust the size of this radius. I can adjust which plane it's on, much like you can when you create like a circle. I can adjust the start angle, so I can only have these clones be part of the circle, and the end angle does the same thing from the opposite side. Offset basically rotates all the clones together. Offset variation adds some randomness to the placement on the circle, right? So you could play with this. You could, have, some objects on here if you're interested in doing that. We're not going to be using this mode. There's also linear, which this is really good for making staircases. If I decrease this height, you can kind of see that here's all the settings for how each clone should act per step. If I set this to 3, let's set this to 4 actually. And then we're going to increase our count significantly. So we actually have a little tower of these things that we can look at, right? You can see that if I have this set to 4 in the Y, that's great. But I can also say, let's do this in the Z so we can see it from this view. If I set it 4 centimeters in the Z, you'll see that I'm getting this diagonal, right? And so I said it's a pretty good way to make a staircase because you can offset these things in a uniform way over and over and over again. If I add 4 here, it's going to be, right, you can, this view makes it look like it's aligned to that axis, but that's not true, right? It's actually here in, split evenly between all 3 planes. If I do rotation, we won't see anything with the spheres because they're spheres, but you can see this is rotating all of these clones, maybe not the same amount. Let's see here. Let's do 15 degrees per step. And then I'm going to make my cube a little bit bigger. I'm going to make it 4 in one direction so it's a little easier to see. Yeah, so you can see it's per step. So it rotates 15, 30, 45, etc., 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 all the way up, and it just keeps going, right? So this is, all of these are per step values. So we can also do scale. So if I say 50%, right, what it's going to do is it's going to increase the scale from the bottom to the top. So if I set this to 100, right, that's even. If I set this to 200, it will expand the entire thing. If I set this to 25%, right, it kind of shrinks things down a little bit in the X. Down here, it's kind of hard to see, but it flats these in this side. And so that's why we're getting these weird, crazy, strange patterns here. If I set this to 0, oops, not 0. If I set this to 100, right, it's basically, it makes it more uniform. If I set this to 25%, right, you can see we kind of get a similar thing. If I was to do all of these at the same time, it would expand the way it's supposed to, but we're not going to do that. Okay, so the other set of settings for this one are the step modes. And so what this does is it actually rotates the steps, right? It's not rotating the object. It's actually rotating that this step goes forward and up this much, but this kicks it over 2.2 degrees that direction, and then 2.2 more, 2.2 more, 2.2 more, until you get this kind of spirally looking thing. And if I keep going, right, it eventually will kind of helix around like that. I can also do other directions, right? So I can get these to, right, to do some really strange things. Okay, so this is like a super fast overview of these different settings. The only other one, honeycomb, we're going to look at real quick. And it's so huge right now that we're not going to be able to see it. So I'm going to set this to 30 and 30. And what honeycomb does, right, is it makes a honeycomb grid. It's basically the same as the grid, except you can't do 3 dimensions. You just do the 2-dimensional grid. And it offset, right, everything's zigzagged, right? Those clones, the rows or columns are zigzagged from one another in a honeycomb shape. All right, so let's go to the object mode. This is the one we're actually going to be more focused on in terms of setting up clones. And what object mode does is it allows you to use an object as the surface that the cloner is applied to. So to start with, we're just going to create a platonic. And with this platonic, let's make it smaller. Let's make it 30 centimeters. That seems to be a good size. Now that we've got this set, if we go to our cloner, you'll see there's this field here that says object. I can either click on this little picker thing and then choose the object, right? And you can see now I have some clones on the surface of this thing. Or I can actually click and drag this platonic down into my object panel. So let's look at some of the settings that we've got available to us here. First, we're in surface. The surface distribution is what we're in currently. And we currently have a count of 20 clones on the surface. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to blast this number up, right? I've got it set to 100 now. That's where the slider ends, but that's not the total number of clones you can use. You can manually come in here and enter in 1,000, right, or 5,000. At some point, your computer is going to be mad at you. But, right, so you can go ahead and create a whole bunch of clones on this surface. I am going to leave this at 1,000. And then there's some other settings here. There's align clone. If I uncheck that, you'll see that all the clones, the spheres don't seem to matter, but right, all of these are aligned exactly the same way. And that's the alignment that they would have in the actual world if it wasn't a clone at this point. So if I go back to my cloner and I turn align clone back on, you'll note that there's this up vector option that pops up. So up vector basically means which direction should these objects be pointing. And it's not whether they're pointing, what direction they're pointing in terms of like the world, but it's in terms of it's relative to the clone itself, to the object they're cloned to. So if I go ahead and instead of using a cube here, if we go ahead and create a cone, it's gonna act like a nice arrow. And then I'm gonna set my bottom radius to 2 and my height to 4. And then I'm going to make this a child of the cloner as well. And you can see, right, we actually have 3 sets here of different objects. I'm going to uncheck the cube so they're hidden. They're still part of the cloner. They're still taking up space on that surface and in the distribution, but they're just invisible. So now we can see these cones a little bit better. So I have the up vector set to y, right? So along all of these surfaces, they're pointing towards the center, this y-axis, right? And it's not like they're perfectly pointing that way, but they are pointing towards it. Then if I was to say z plus, right, they're all going to kind of more or less be pointing towards the z-axis as best they can from their orientation on the surface. And the same goes for x, right? They're all going to be pointing towards the x. Or if I flip this around, they'll all be pointing more or less towards x minus. Okay, so this is the surface distribution. If we switch our and there's the seed value, right? We can change that number to change where the clones are aligned. I'm going to go back to no up vector. And if I go here to vertex, right, what this does is it's going to place a clone on each vertex. Now, you'll notice some of these don't have any clones, and that's because, right, the cube is hidden. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull the cube out of the cloner so we have clones on each one of these vertices. And so, right, this is the number of clones you don't have access to change because it's based on how many vertices this object has. If I turn on Gerard shading lines real quick so that when I do this we can see what happens, right? But if I go to my Platonic and I increase the number of segments, right, now there's clones at all of those new vertices. If I increase it again, there's clones at all of those new vertices, and so on and so forth until I cover that surface entirely. I'm going to go back to one segment and go back to my cloner. And then let's look at what else we've got. We've got edge. So edge, right, it does basically the same thing, except it puts them all in the center of the edge. And then it allows you to slide these clones from one vertex to the other. So you can kind of adjust, you know, where their alignment is. If I uncheck align clones, right, they just kind of all point up or whatever direction they were originally pointing in. If I go to polygon center, right, they're going to be in the center of the polygon. And there are a few times when you can use this enable scaling. This is one of them. So in this case, I should be able to scale my clones. I'm not sure why it's not letting me enable, or not letting me scale them. Weird. Well, whatever the case, I'm not too worried about it. Is it reset coordinates that needs to be unchecked for this to work? Nope. I'm not exactly sure why it was letting me a minute ago. Anyway, so we've got our we've got this set up. That's fantastic. Polygon center. And then there's also volume. And so volume allows you to have clones that basically fill the volume of the object. And so I have 1,000 set here currently because I think it's the same setting as for surface. Yeah, except what it does is it makes them in the volume. So if I go to volume, and I could come in over here, and if I didn't want this Platonic visible, I can turn this off, and you can kind of see all of these clones inside this thing. I can even, if I uncheck the actual object, right, all my clones disappear because it disables the object. The other thing, if I want this geometry here so I can see it while I'm making changes, I can come over to my basic tab on my Platonic objects attributes and check mark X-ray so I can kind of see the surface but see through the surface. And you'll note that, right, some of the clones are penetrating the surface, but most are filling that void. And that's, see here, I was going to see if this, right? And adjusting the level, the number of polygons or whatever doesn't make any impact on this whatsoever. There is one thing we can do in this mode that will allow us to pack these in here without them being on the protruding through the surface, and that's by changing the volume mode here from random to surface. And basically that does the same thing as surface mode. However, one of the nice settings with volume and surface mode is if I come over to this transform tab in my cloner, I can move clones around, and in this case you can see those individual polygons of clones are sliding off into space, maintaining their shape and uniformity to one another, but just flying into space, which is kind of awesome. If I do that along the X, if I do it along the Y, I'm going to get the same result, but just like along a different axis. And if I do it in the Z, they either go out or they come in. So in this case, I can actually bring these in so they are all inside the bounds of this object. So if I'm wanting to put something inside an object that's on a cloner and use the surface distribution to do that, I can do this. The other nice thing is, right, you'll notice that if I don't have this here at all, they're all halfway through. And remember, we're going to be having marbles rolling on a surface. And so we wouldn't want them halfway through the surface that they're on. We want them to be on top of that surface. And so we are going to go ahead and change the object that we're using. I was using this, the cloner, or I was using the platonic because it has fewer polygons and can show us some things before we jump into what we're going to do next, which is to grab a landscape. And this landscape is pretty huge. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. Let's make our landscape a little bit smaller. We're going to set this to, let's just say 300 by, let's keep it at 100. It's going to be slopey by 300, right? It's a meter tall. Maybe we should do, let's do 25. We don't need this to be totally crazy. It'll be easier to photograph and stuff too. Okay. So let's go ahead and distribute our spheres on this. So what we're going to do is first we'll pull our cone out. So we just have marbles. Then we're going to take our cloner. We're going to go to the Object tab, and we're going to click on that little eyedropper and switch from the platonic to the landscape. Now that I've changed to the landscape, I have to say, where did all my clones go? So my clones disappeared for a minute there, and all I did was I changed my distribution from volume to surface. Oh, interesting. Now they're gone again. I have a feeling that because I had them all tucked inside here, if I rotate my view, nope, they are gone. That's an interesting little bug. Well, let's go ahead and go back to volume. Let's uncheck scaling. Vertex. Okay, there they are. Terrifyingly on every single vertex on this landscape. Let's go ahead and go back to surface. Okay, now they're showing up. There's some weird things going on. I'm going to go ahead and check my transform. That's all set to 0. Okay, so I've got this set to transform. Let's see what happens if I adjust this. Yeah, you can see it looked like gravity was going away there for a second. They're all floating up. What we need to do is we want to set this right to the, let's go to 2 centimeters. That should put all of these so that they are on the surface, but they are not, yeah, they're just barely touching that surface. Now, I do want you to note that when you have a lot of clones like this, there's more and more chance that they're going to intersect. There's nothing with the cloner that says, hey, don't have these objects intersect. I'm going to set this to 500 instead. And I'm still getting some intersections. There's ways we can actually hide different clones and things like that so we could solve some of these problems. And maybe we can go ahead and do that now. So let's see here. Let's see if we can get that to work real quick. Okay, so you can see even with 500, we still have a bunch of these where they are connected. So what we're going to do is, there's no way we can say don't have clones intersect here. But what we can do is we can go through and manually essentially hide the clones that are intersecting. So if we go up to the top of the screen, MoGraph means motion graphics, and it's where the cloner located and some of these other generators as well. But what we want to do is we want to go to this MoGraph selection tool, which I've already got selected. And we want to select the, oops, not what I wanted to do. We want to say MoGraph selection tool. And then what we can do is we can go over these clones. And if I click and drag, and if I click and hold down, you'll see there's all these little dots, right? And those are the indices for these different clones. So if I select that clone and I'm going to hold down Shift, select one of these other ones that's intersected, maybe select that one too. And we're not going to do all of these because that's insane, but any of the, like maybe just a handful of these that are really close. So I've got those handful selected in orange. And then what I can do is I can come up here and I can go back to my MoGraph menu. And there's this option here that's hide selected. So if I click on that, those clones that were overlapping are now hidden, right? So this can be a really useful tool for doing lots of interesting things. Okay, so there's one, so now we've got a scene where we can actually set up a light and we can get some really good, right, a good close-up of something and some other objects that are further away. There's one other use of the cloner that I want to show you before we do anything else, and that is to use a spline and have objects follow a spline. So what we're going to do is we will go to points mode. We're going to go to one of the side views or top views. Let's go to the right view. And I'm going to use my sketch pen tool over here. And what I want to do is I want like some sort of a loop or something that comes up, but it doesn't have to go very high because, right, this is going to be close. So I'm just going to start down here and I'm just going to have something that kind of zigs up and zigs back down like that. And I could take some time to smooth this if I wanted to, using the spline smooth tool, and just, and I'm just clicking and a little bit to smooth this out. You may need to click and drag. It depends on the strength setting. Mine's set to 100% right now. But that just cleans it up so there aren't going to be as many harsh edges between our clones. Okay, so let's go back to our primary view. And we are going to get out of points mode. We're going to go back to objects mode. And then we're going to create a second cloner. And let's go ahead and create a let's create a torus, which is huge. And then we will set the, let's see here, the ring radius is going to be 4. And the pipe radius will be 2. And I think that should probably get us down to a reasonably small size. Let's put this in the cloner real quick. so we can actually see a clone. Yeah, it looks like that's probably all right. And then we are going to go ahead and create a cylinder as well. And again, this time let's make our radius 2 and our height 4. And we will make this a child of our cloner as well. And then what we're going to need to do is we're going to select our cloner. We're going to go to object mode. And then we are going to select this, and we're going to click on our spline that we just created. And now if we zoom in a little bit, you'll see that we've got some clones along the spline. They're not necessarily oriented the way we would like, and they are spaced really oddly. So what we're going to do is we're going to make some adjustments here. The first thing is with the cylinder, we can adjust, right, the orientation that it's at. So I have my cylinder selected. If I make this Z+, then my cylinders are going to align with the spline. If I go to my torus and do the same thing, right, my torus is also going to align with the spline. Okay, so now I've got these things set. So let's go ahead and make some changes to our cloner. So we're back in our cloner, and you'll see there's a whole bunch of different settings here. We're not going to talk about all of them, but the most important ones here are going to be our distribution. Right now it's count, and count is 10, so let's make this 100 so we have more copies, right? But you can see that there's like a bunch more clones in certain areas and fewer in others. And that's because what it's doing is it's clustering them where along this, it's basically subdividing it by segment, right? That's what this per segment means. So if a segment is shorter, it's still going to have, you know, say there's 10 segments, it's still going to have 10 clones. It's just going to have 10 clones in a much smaller space. So if we uncheck per segment, right, it doesn't actually make any difference. So what we need to do is we need to change our distribution to one of these other options. There's step, which clearly in our case is not going to work, because what that's done is it's saying our step is 100 centimeters, right? So here I could say, oh, let's make the step 4 centimeters. That actually kind of works pretty well. There's other options too. We can do even. And what even does is it basically distributes them evenly along the spline, right? So it takes your total number and it distributes them evenly. And you can see that in this case, 100 is probably too much for that length. 50 is probably better. So in our case, even or step could work. Vertex, basically any place there's a point on the spline, it's going to be dropping a clone, and that's it. So that's not really useful for us in this case. If we go ahead and say, let's go back to even, because that'll work pretty well for our case. And then I'm going to say my torus is too big. I want this to be a little bit more like a solid object. So I am going to set my pipe radius can stay the same. I'm going to set my ring radius to, let's say 3. I'm going to zoom in a little bit and rotate my view, right? And so now it kind of looks, I don't know what's going on here, but it looks like that. And so we're going to use this as one of our objects in the scene. Okay, so there are more settings. You can do offset and offset variation, kind of like you could with the radial one. And you can scale this over time, which I don't know where that setting is. Yeah, and then there should be under transform, you could do things like, move everything, right, offset the clones, rotate clones, and do other things that we don't need to do in this case. Okay, so let's save our scene. And I'm just going to call this tutorial 11 clones and save that. Okay, and then we will do the next tutorial where we'll focus on lights and cameras and getting things looking really awesome.